Hello, everybody. I am Kim Scott, and I'm here with the great
Wesley Faulkner. Well, I mean, it's me. I don't. Maybe
You
you're
are the
talking
great
about someone
Wesley
else.
Faulkner.
Okay, yes, I'm the only one that's in the room on this podcast anyway, and
uh,
I'm here with our guest. Okay,
Nobody.
yeah,
It's
there's
just the
nobody.
two of us today. But we're going to make it totally worth your while. It's going to be a good day. So, Wesley, you want to just jump into the reading and then we'll tell some stories and
Y-
then we'll call it a wrap?
yes. This
All
is going to
right.
be a story-filled episode, so I'm happy for this.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. All right. Shared norms take shame out of the game. It's important that the person whose bias has been disrupted is treated respectfully, and equally important that they respond with respect. But these are hard moments. Most people feel deeply ashamed when their biases are pointed out. Our fight or flight instincts are activated. We rarely respond well in such moments. How can leaders help themselves and their employees learn to respond when their biases are pointed out, like the respectful colleagues they aspire to be? If we are going to disrupt bias, the only way out of these feelings of shame is through. The solution is to work out a shared norm for responding. Thank you is a good place to start, but it doesn't go far enough. If the person who said or did the biased thing understands why what they said or did was biased, they can say, "You're right. I'm sorry. Thank you for pointing it out." This can be tricky because sometimes a person or a whole team may be trying to change a deeply ingrained habit of speech. That will take time. If your team is working on saying simply you instead of you guys, it may be useful to have a jar into which people put a pebble when they make a mistake. If the person doesn't understand or disagrees, they should know to say something like, "Thanks for pointing it out, but I don't understand why what I said was biased. Can someone explain it to me after the meeting or send me an article to read?" This is hard. When I've been in that situation, I felt doubly ashamed. I harmed someone and I'm ignorant. Having a norm to fall back on in such moments reassures me that I'm not alone. It's a norm because it's not uncommon for us to harm each other without even being aware of it. And it reminds me that I want to be aware so that I don't do it again. The reason not to discuss it in the meeting is that bias happens so often that meetings would get derailed if these conversations happened every time it occurred. At the risk of repeating myself, the goal here is to disrupt the bias without disrupting the meeting. Of course, at times the meeting should be disruptive. If someone disrupted, if someone on a promotion committee, for example, is objecting to someone's promotion for reasons that feel biased, then the promotion decision shouldn't be made without resolving the bias of the without resolving the basis of the objection. If you don't do this, bias gives way to discrimination. In order to make this norm a reality and not merely an aspiration, start with yourself. Disrupt your own biases whenever you notice them, or ask the people on your team who are most comfortable challenging you to disrupt your biases in a meeting. Lead by example with your response. Thank them for pointing it out. Reaffirm that this is how you as a team will change destructive patterns of thought or speech. So now we've talked about a shared vocabulary. That's what we talked about last time. Now there's a shared norm for responding when you're the one who's biased. You want to stop and talk about that, or should I read about a shared commitment, Wesley?
Let's talk about this briefly.
Okay.
And I really like. It feels like, of course, since we're working through the book, I'm bringing up some things I've brought up before about like sometimes when you're in that agitated state, it might be hard to recall or know what to say next. And so having
Yeah.
that practice and having that standby or the thing that you know what to say in those situations is extremely helpful. So if it's a
Yes.
thank you or I appreciate you pointing that out, or it can help really quell that defensive response of I didn't mean it that way, or you know what I'm trying to say, that
Yeah.
those that or either diminish it or either brush it off in some way. So as a tool, it's a really great tool to have. And And if someone's reading this and just like, thank you, that's simple. Of course, I can remember to say that. But it takes practice. And the time between hearing it, realizing it, and then saying it is something that the time gets diminished as often as you are able to practice it.
Yeah, you got to build the muscle. And I think it's the other thing that as I was reading this, I wasn't sure if it was as clear as it could have been, but I feel like there are part of the defensiveness that happens. And by the way, if I'm the one who said the biased thing and I'm feeling defensive, I have got to own that. If I'm feeling ashamed, that is because of me, and that's mine to manage. It's not the job of the people around me. Brene Brown has a really good podcast on this, sort of more talking to white people who respond terribly when we I guess are say or do something that is racially biased, and then it gets pointed out, and often because of the shame we don't respond very well. So and her point is like, it's not that someone shamed me, it's that I feel ashamed because I said or did something that's wrong, and there's a world of difference between those two things. So that's number one. There's just that instinctive feeling of shame when there's bias, and then there can be shame upon shame. Like sometimes there's a word that we say, like in our last podcast that we recorded, we're talking about you guys. It was so hard, so we know it's a problem, we agree it's a problem, we're trying to stop, and yet it's hard. It's like it's hard to change habits. And so that can feel that can intensify the feelings of shame. Luckily, our guest, Dr. Phil, had a good sense of humor about it, but that's not always the case. So helping your team to develop that kind of, to respond like Dr. Phil did last week when he kept making the same mistake, because it's hard. But we also have to be persistent in the face of those habits. And then there's another thing that can sometimes add to the feelings of shame, which is like, I don't even know, you say, you wave a purple flag or you say bias alert. I don't even know what I did wrong. And that is that makes me feel doubly ashamed. So it's really useful, I think, to remind everyone that we're all in that situation sometimes, and we got to move through it. Only
Yes,
way out
and
is through.
yeah, and making sure that someone, don't assume that someone already knows what the thing that they did or the history of a word or a phrase
Yeah.
is. And what you're saying about it's really ingrained, it's the same with filler words. Some people might go or say like a lot in order to kind of transition from one place of a conversation to another, and those are really hard to get rid of, and you have to give that same grace to the person who is trying to really work to eliminate some troublesome language that they even if they do know, it takes a lot of time and practice to get rid of. So if you can use that as a practice to kind of have some compassion for the person who's really trying to work through this, that was a good way to illustrate how hard it might be to eliminate some of that phrasing.
Yeah. And when we have compassion for other people, we're more likely to have compassion for ourselves as well. An added benefit
Absolutely.
of having
Yes.
compassion, because we're all going to make these mistakes in different ways. But bias, I don't know anybody who doesn't have any biases.
Yeah. And that shame that you're saying, sometimes that the worst voice is the one that's internal.
Yeah, often.
And yeah, often. And so, like you're saying, if you can have compassion for others, you'll have more compassion for yourself and help you work through some of this.
Yeah, silence that terrible voice on 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 top of your shoulder.
Yes.
All right, you ready for the second part of the reading? This is about a
Yes.
shared commitment. Or did you have something else to say about?
No, I'm just waiting for you to share the
All
next
right,
reading.
here we go. A shared commitment builds stamina. Even if you all come up with a shared vocabulary and a shared norm, bias disruptions will likely not take hold immediately. It's a little bit like diet or exercise or any other behavior change. If you've gone a while without disrupting any bias, it probably doesn't mean that your team magically eliminated bias. It means that either nobody noticed the bias or that they didn't feel comfortable pointing it out. So take a minute to recommit to the process. Remind your team that when we ignore bias or fail to notice it, we reflect and reinforce it, even if we don't intend to. As Ruha Benjamin, the author of Race After Technology, pointed out, we are pattern makers. We can change bad patterns and replace them with better ones, but only if we learn to recognize the bad patterns, our own biases. Also, remind your team to share the work. The whole weight can't fall on your shoulders as a leader. Even less should it fall on the shoulders of the people who are harmed by the bias. If they are the only ones speaking up, they'll get tired of talking and it will be harder for the team to listen. Hold folks accountable for upstanding. If you, as a leader, are consistently the only person who interrupts bias, point that out. Let everyone in the room know you expect them to do the same. Do your fair share of bias disrupting, but you can't be the only one. Your job is to lead by example and to hold others accountable for doing their fair share of disrupting bias. It's so hard to read what I've written out loud because I see all the mistakes and it feels so repetitive. Anyway, but that's not what you were going to say. What are your thoughts?
I think it reinforces what I just said, but also how important it is to make sure you do this during the onboarding. It's
Yeah.
hard to just change directions, but if it's in your company culture, if it's in your team's culture, and you're able to continuously reinforce it, then it allows people to really understand what the social norms are within that operational environment. Everyone's when they're starting, they're always trying to figure out who has power, who can say what is allowed, what is disallowed, who is the in crowd. I think this harkens back to our previous conversation before we started recording, that people want to fit in and people want to do the thing that will help their status, also help make sure that they show that they belong with everyone else. And if this isn't great in the culture, then people know by participating and upholding this way of calling out and calling in, then it shows that that's how they show that they are part of the culture and part of the group. But and making sure that you reward that and point that out is also some reinforcing behavior that is great to highlight.
Totally agree. Well, thank you. I mean, so what do you disagree with in this in the bias disruption process? What do you think won't work? Because it's hard for teams to roll it out, and frankly, a lot of teams get excited about it and then they don't. So, what do you think? What would you tell those teams to get them to? It's a little bit like we've just read something about how important it is to exercise X times a week, but that doesn't mean people are going to go out and exercise X times a week.
The reason why this is so hard is that people and organizations are inconsistent. I could be part of the best group in the world, but then I still do need to interface with another team or another department. And they have their own norms. And the question is, what's the tiebreaker? And it just goes up a level, right? And does the higher order of management also espouse the same thing? And sometimes they don't, or sometimes it is so much lower on their priority list that they don't want to have to coach it, police it, referee it, whatever you want to call it. And so that that part is hard to stay on top of and be consistent. And then once again, if someone is fired, someone is let go, someone else is hired, a new layer of bureaucracy is added in. There's a huge round of layoffs or some existential threat to the company's existence. All that stuff can throw things into turmoil where in this chaos, some of the priorities also get reshifted and things get lost. I think
Yeah.
we see this during the recession too, is that some of the first people who or groups or departments to be let go were DE and I, for instance, because they were
Yeah.
seen as not being able to bring in money. So people might have a good talk, but then when the rubber hits the road, then it really gets fleshed out that, belonging is their top priority. Oh, not right now, not this week.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and
It changes and shifts.
yeah, and I think part of it may be, there's some existential threat or some economic problem, but I also think even if the economy were doing great right now and there were no existential threats right now, unfortunately, I'm afraid that a lot of what is happening, a lot of the back off would still be happening. And I don't know if I've
Hmm.
told you, but here's this analogy that I have.
Okay.
It's denial complex, which I think is a much bigger part of the story of Oedipus Rex than the Oedipal complex. So when Oedipus realizes that he has done something really wrong, what does he do? He
Gouge his
does
eyes out.
not what?
I said gouge his eyes out.
Yes, he gouges his eyes out. It's like the ultimate sort of maybe violent expression of denial, but it's kind of and it feels a little bit to me like that's what. Have I said this before to you? Have I
I
laid
believe
this one
so.
on you?
Maybe.
Okay, I have. Okay.
I don't know if it was
Anyway,
recorded or not, but
sorry
yes.
if I'm repeating myself, but I think about this all the time. Okay, so Wesley, stories. What stories do you have for our listeners?
Well, I'm not sure if you brought up denial complex though. I want you to finish that out because I do
Oh,
think that is new.
yeah, so that is what I mean, that what I think, there was all of these organizations after Me Too and after the murder of George Floyd were doing all this really
Mhm.
good work and important work, I think. And it really, I think, has dried up to a remarkable and disheartening extent in the last sort of year and a half, I would say. I don't know, when would you say
Oh,
the disinvestment began?
yeah, I agree. Right when there was a real kind of like a contraction in talent and being able to hire people, where these were seen more as an incentive or a differentiator or a benefit by touting these programs. And I think since the economy itself has loosened, it's probably people are feeling that they don't need to spend money or highlight these programs, but they would still be able to get the talent that they think that they need.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm sure there's a market side to it as well as just a basic human denial side to it. But
Yeah.
it's that it worries me because I mean the thing that gives me a sense of hope and optimism is that people were telling these stories more openly about the experiences that they were having, both at work and sort of more broadly. And then all of a sudden, they people quit talking and people quit
Hmm.
investing, and I feel like we're retreating back into this denial, and that's not acceptable. I mean, you know,
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. It's funny. I think everyone, or I shouldn't say everyone. I don't know. I think there was a sense that a lot of people were talking about their experiences and sharing deep knowledge. And then there is a way of belonging by joining in that. But as the same time, when people are talking less, it could be the same phenomenon where people feel to belong is to talk less about that stuff.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I, I, remarkably, I've been the same no matter what. So I'm a person that's an open book, and I just gave a talk 2 weeks ago in London, and it still amazes me by speaking my truth and what I've experienced and just being honest. That itself is still a differentiator. People say that was brave
yeah,
or it touched me, and because that thing, that honesty, where people can see themselves in your experiences, is extremely powerful to the point where, to me, it feels unremarkable, but other people have the exact same power, but choose not to use it. And that's the
yeah,
only difference between me and them. And I think it's the same with these stories and these experiences that there is a sense of otheredness when in fact it's a sense of belonging to be able to kind of connect on that level.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's really well said. Because if you can't share your story, then you feel excluded,
Yes.
you know? Just
And you
very
feel like in the minority and you think that
yeah,
the majority has the power. But if everyone
yeah,
did it, that's when people feel that they can join in and feel safe, that safety
yeah,
and that connection.
yeah. Build solidarity. Totally
Which
agree.
is exactly why we do this podcast, right?
Yes,
So
that is why we're doing this podcast.
we want to have everyone be seen, and it's I hopefully it's a movement. I'm not saying we're going to start it, but I think hopefully we can help with making sure that people have the cover they need to feel that they can share their experiences and find a sense of connection with those who also listen to this podcast.
Absolutely.
Story time.
Story time. Speaking of stories.
I think we talked about belonging and
Mhm.
the month, uh, it being ADHD Awareness Month. This is in
Mhm.
October. And every month there's an awareness month, which is great. I think it's also Breast Cancer Awareness Month.
Yes,
But
and,
it
Hispanic Heritage Month,
Yes,
I think also.
exactly. Yes. And I think in Disability Employment Awareness Month, and I think this is also the thing that gives cover by allowing people to come together and share these stories in a place and a time where everyone or who feels like they have the need to do so, that it feels appropriate
Yeah,
because I have the excuse because of the calendar.
yeah,
And I have ADHD. I think I've shared that before. And one of the things that I'm doing, luckily, is that in my company, they're bringing us together, several people, and we're going to have a panel. And so, it's been on my mind about some of the questions and misconceptions of ADHD, and some of the things that I hear related to other marginalized groups. And I thought I would like share some of those, if that's okay.
yeah,
One of the things is the hero complex of the minority. Sometimes you hear this about like border security or immigrants. Immigrants are the hardest workers, blah, blah, blah.
yeah,
And some of them are lazy because we're all lazy because I mean, we all are people. We have different shades and different motivations. And some of the things with the talk about people with ADHD or people who are neurodivergent is that they call some of the things superpowers. I like that. It sounds really great. But I also don't want it to feel um, almost like the woe of the superhero who has to hide their identity, or
yeah,
it's more of the things of there are the person I was working with, they ask the question or they're phrasing some of the questions, and one of the things that they say is like, do you want to talk about some of the things that you've overcome to be able to be successful in your current role even though you have this thing? And that notion of overcoming is kind of like the hero's journey of
mhm,
having something that despite all the odds, I was able to get to where I was or am. And I want to dispel that myth. Um, it's something I struggle with, and it is something that I will always struggle with. And it's not a struggle in all cases. That sometimes the environment is the thing that disables me, and it's not just me.
yeah,
And so if I was given the right under the right context, under the right environment, I can thrive. But under a different environment, I could really struggle. And it's not just something that it's internally managed, and sometimes it's external as well. And that's the thing that I want to make sure that people who have difficulties because of their environment sometimes feel it's a personal failure
yeah,
because they haven't find the right coping skills, or they haven't found the right method or way of communicating it. And it, there's not necessarily an overcoming that has to happen or does happen. And I guess that's the biggest thing that I wanted to kind of put out there, that sometimes having the psychological safety to say, you know what, I'm not going to make any of my tasks this week. I know they're due this week. And being able to say that and have the permission to say that because you've been too distracted or your prescription didn't get filled. Those are things that allow people to say, I need help, and then others to say, I will help you. And without that give and take in an organization or a group, or it's really hard to not internalize that struggle and just wait to the due date and say, okay, I didn't do it, and then feel not only worse, but put your your colleagues in a difficult position because they were counting on you to do that thing. So I guess that's I feel like I'm rambling now, but basically the summation of this is that there needs to be internal structures and external structures in order for a person to feel that they're able to produce their best work and do the right thing when the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is what we owe each other at work and in school is to create the environment in which each person can be their best selves. And there are
Yes,
certain things that are going to make it really hard for you to work at your best, and there are certain things that are going to make it hard for me to work at my best. And I think we all need to do a better job respecting what other people need and asserting what we as individuals need.
absolutely.
Um,
And we need to trash the golden rule and really embrace the
the
platinum rule.
platinum rule. So,
Yes.
do you want to
And
explain to people what you mean by that? I agree with you.
sure. I think there's a lot of people who know the golden rule, which is treat others how you would like to be treated. What that does is kind of remove compassion and only focuses on empathy. It assumes that you can feel what the other person feels because you're putting yourself in their shoes and you would know how to treat them based on that. The platinum rule is treating people how they would like to be treated. And that is understanding that people are different and what you would want in a situation is not necessarily what they would want in the same exact situation, and really leads on compassion. Just because you can't understand what someone's motivation or what someone needs, having a conversation and allowing that have a transparent conversation about those things allows you to be able to give them what they need in the way that they need it. And so that is the work that needs to happen in order to facilitate the platinum rule. Treat others like they would like to be treated.
So well said. So well said. And I think, everyone, even people who are quote unquote neurotypical are not like we're all different, you know?
Yes.
And is that the right word even to use?
Yes,
Neuro,
that is
yeah,
a right word, of course. Yes,
yeah,
so it's one that is known, so it
yeah,
holds a place that you're trying to communicate. So
yeah.
yes,
Um, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. When I was growing up, this was not something that got tested for, but I have been
Mhm.
told by several of my colleagues that if I tested, I would probably find that I too have ADHD, but I don't know. But I did fail kindergarten because I was not in the right environment to learn. It was really hard for me, and I struggled with feeling stupid for like the next 15 years. It's hard.
Yes, and because of that, when you're saying everyone's different, everyone also has their own trauma, and some people
Yes.
won't categorize it as trauma; they'll call it as a bad experience or all this stuff. But it's trauma that we all deal with different levels of how severe and critical and important. But we all have these things where it people can use it to drive them, people can use it to motivate them, but also it can be a barrier to different things, but like not trying too hard or not excelling, or someone who needs to excel because they need to make sure that they are at the top of the class. That's how they find their own personal fulfillment. So there are ways that people, even in, like I said, like you were saying, like who are considered neurotypical, that still you will not be
Nobody's
able to
typical.
understand. Yeah. There's a book called gosh, I
The
think
end of
there is.
average, is that what you're thinking
Well,
about? The guy that studied
yes, yes.
the cockpits?
Yes,
I
yes,
love so
yes.
tell that story. I love this. It's so good.
Oh, it goes into the history that the normal is made up.
Yeah,
The
there's no such
definition,
thing as the
there's no such
average
thing.
person.
There used to be contests about who is the most average by doing these measurements and doing these calculations, but it all is just math, and it's just that. Then it's also thinking about like typical women, typical men. It's extremely culture based as well too,
Yeah.
because of different environments, and it's just basically just saying if you wrote everything down that of what an average person is, you would not be able to find one person that would be able to
Yeah.
check those boxes.
Yeah, and I think the author of this did a study that they were designing cockpits. The Air Force was designing cockpits, and they were trying to design a cockpit for the average sized pilot. you know, and that cockpit did not fit anyone. So speaking of
Hmm.
the environment, that environment was good for nobody. So we got to adjust for each person who we encounter. And I think it's especially important to recognize
Hmm.
our colleagues who have ADHD and ask them what they need, but not to make assumptions about them.
And I'm also realizing something that maybe you and I should sit down and go through all the books that we've read and see how much overlap there is.
I
Because
bet there's enormous
I
overlap.
think there's a huge, that's really, really uncanny. So, yes, yes,
That's
have
funny.
grace and have compassion.
Yes, and treat each person as an individual, not as a typical so and so.
Yes. I think I've also, since we're talking about books, I've brought this up probably multiple times, but I think it's relevant. It's the Against Empathy is the book that I brought up
Yes, Paul
before.
Bloom.
And, yes, and so if you are looking to delve more into this, I would really suggest that book.
And speaking of books, there's another book that I read called Driven to Distraction about ADHD, and it really helped me have more compassion for it. It's a wonderful. I don't know if you've read that one, but it's a great
I
book.
have not. Um,
Well, you
and
can let me know what you think. Maybe I'm all wrong, but I found it very helpful.
what are we talking about? I'm sorry.
Driven to Distraction is a book
I know.
about AD.
I'm just messing with you. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I
Yes.
I fell for it.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Wesley. Always, always a pleasure. Loved the conversation. And where can folks write to us if they have a story they want to share?
Oh, of course. They can write to us at hello at
Just
justworktogether.com. Yeah, I got
perfect. You got
it.
it. I couldn't remember for a minute either. That's why I asked you.
I was
All right.
distracted.
Thank you so much. Great talking.
Yes. Take care.
Take care.